Hello everyone, and welcome back to Royalty Now. Empress Sisi was known throughout 19th century Europe for her legendary beauty. But behind the glamour was a complex woman whose goodwill and eccentricity would garner her the love of thousands and the hate of a few. Today we'll tell Sisi's story and then of course reveal some recreations of her appearance. So let's go ahead and get started. Duchess Elizabeth Amalie Eugenie, nicknamed Sisi, was born in Munich in the Kingdom of Bavaria on the 24th of December 1837. She was the third of 7 children born to her father, Duke Maximilian Joseph, and her mother, Princess Ludovica. Although her family was of high nobility, Sisi's upbringing was pretty unconventional, at least compared to other royal families. Instead of lessons in etiquette or languages, the children were allowed to enjoy themselves, playing together and hiking through the Bavarian countryside. When Sisi learned to ride horseback, she became obsessed, and throughout the rest of her childhood and into her teens, a free-spirited nature began to blossom in the young Elizabeth. In 1853, Sisi's older sister Helena received a party invitation from their aunt, Archduchess Sophie, the overbearing mother of the newly crowned Emperor of Austria, Franz Josef I. It was a tempting invitation. Although Franz and Helena had never met, it was clear to everyone involved that Archduchess Sophie was playing matchmaker. Princess Ludovica, Helena, and Sisi would all make the journey together. But on the way there, their luggage, which contained luxuriously colored summer dresses meant to dazzle at the Habsburg court, were separated from their coach. They were forced to make an emergency stop with their Aunt Teresa. But Teresa was in mourning and only had black dresses to spare. On August 16, 1853, Helena was presented to the Emperor of Austria wearing all black. Helena, who had a natural dark coloring and was already quiet and serious, looked very austere in her dress. When the Emperor's gaze wandered to the beautiful, lively auburn-haired woman behind Helena, he fell in love instantly. Just 2 days later, he would ask Elizabeth to marry him. His mother, Sophie, was outraged. She had had other plans for her son. Archduchess Sophie was an incredibly domineering person, bullying and terrorizing everyone she had to until she got her way. And this act of disobedience by her son Franz would not go unpunished. But it would be Sisi who would feel her anger most harshly. The couple were married on April 24, 1854, and barely more than strangers to each other, Sisi and Franz moved into the family's summer palace together in beautiful Upper Austria. Within only a few months, they learned that Sisi was pregnant, and 10 months after their wedding, Sisi gave birth to their first child. But she would be instantly robbed of any joy by her mother-in-law, who immediately took the baby from her. Sophie would name the infant child after herself, without even consulting Elizabeth, and took charge of all her care, not even allowing Sisi to breastfeed her. When Sisi would protest, Sophie would tell her that she was nothing but a silly young mother. A little more than a year later, Sisi would give birth to a second daughter. Again, Sophie would take this baby under her complete care and name her Gisela. With 2 pregnancies and 2 daughters, gossip began to swirl around the court about Elizabeth's usefulness. One morning, Sisi walked in to find a pamphlet on her desk with the following words underlined: "The natural destiny of a queen is to give an heir to the throne. If the queen is so fortunate as to provide the state with a crown prince, this should be the end of her ambition. If the queen bears no sons, she is merely a foreigner in the state, and a very dangerous foreigner too, for as she can never hope to be looked on kindly here, and must always expect to be sent back whence she came." The barely veiled threat felt like a punch in the guts to Sisi. She could only guess who would be conniving enough to do something like this. Feeling depressed and stifled, Sisi was able to convince her husband to take her and the children to Hungary, away from court and her mother-in-law. The trip would be the first time since their marriage that the couple would be without the pressure of the fishbowl that was the Habsburg court, and finally be alone together. She would fall in love with Hungary, with its beauty reminding her of her childhood. Its people welcomed her with open arms, something she had never felt in Austria. The Hungarians had a free-spirited and rebellious nature, just as she once did. Plus, Archduchess Sophie hated them, which made Sisi love them even more. Sisi would become so enthralled with Hungary that she would learn their language, hoping to form a deeper bond with the people. This single trip would go on to influence the rest of Elizabeth's life in both good and tragic ways. On the way home back to Austria, both of Elizabeth's daughters suddenly got sick. Gisela, her youngest daughter, was able to recover quickly, but her eldest, Sophie, was only getting worse and worse. On May 29, 1857, Sophie died at just 2 years old. When her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, heard the news, she immediately blamed Sisi for the child's death. Elizabeth would have a mental breakdown, undoubtedly hearing Sophie call her a silly young mother over and over in her head. And for the remainder of 1857, Empress Sisi would fall into an incredibly intense depression, no longer having the energy to protest against her youngest daughter being raised by the Archduchess. It would take months before Sisi felt any better, but soon she would receive news that filled her with hope. In December of 1857, Sisi became pregnant a third time, and the court held its breath to see if it would be a prince. 8 months later, Elizabeth would give birth to her third child, a boy named Rudolf Franz Karl Joseph. A 101-gun salute was used to announce the news, and celebrations around the court began. With the birth of an heir, Empress Sisi's popularity at court skyrocketed overnight. But the feelings weren't mutual. She just couldn't forget how horribly she'd been treated until now. If she had influence all of a sudden, she would use it on the things she cared about. Hungary and Austria had been at odds since the Austrian Empire drove out the Ottomans in 1699 and absorbed the Hungarian region. But over the last 150 years, Austria had struggled to govern over Hungary and its people. Hungary's latest resistance had begun in 1848, when revolutions broke out all over the Austrian Empire, with the rise of liberalism in Europe. Although Hungary's bid for independence ultimately failed, it did give its people a new identity and pride in their own nation. But Austria now ruled Hungary with an iron grip. The revolution led to strict and ruthless consequences. Franz Josef would terminate Hungary's constitution and make himself the supreme ruler of its people. He also changed its official language to German and censored Hungarian history in favor of the Austrian narrative. Although she was the Empress of Austria, Sisi was an empathetic and liberal-minded woman, and she would use her influence to try to help the Hungarian people that she had grown to love. But her husband, Franz Josef, was staunchly conservative and was also influenced by his even more conservative mother. In 1860, Italy defeated Austria in their own war for independence, and it became clear to nearly everyone in Europe that Austria wasn't the powerhouse it used to be. If Franz wanted to save Austria from certain ruin, he would have to get over himself. It was around this time that Sisi met a Hungarian count named Gyula Andrassy. Now fluent in Hungarian, she would try to become the mediator between Austria and Hungary. I have just had an interview with Andrassy. He set forth his views clearly and plainly. I quite understood them and arrived at the conclusion that if you would trust him, and trust him entirely, we might still be saved. Not only Hungary, but the monarchy too. If you say no, nothing will remain to me but the consciousness that whatever may happen, I shall be able to say honestly to our son Rudolf one day, I did everything in my power. Your misfortunes are not on my conscience. But even through her begging and pleading, Franz would not budge. Although she was only 22, Sisi had already gone through so much. For months, she'd been distracting herself with politics and negotiations. But now that had fizzled out, Sisi seemed to have a bit of an identity crisis. Was she worthless now that she had given the king an heir? In order to feel control over something in her life, Sisi began to obsessively exercise and starve herself. In October of that year, Elizabeth developed a cough, and doctors feared that she might have tuberculosis. To make things worse, rumors began to spread that her husband had taken a mistress. Elizabeth would use the rumor as an excuse to leave the palace alone, without her children or her husband. For the next 6 months, she would spend the winter in Madeira, off the coast of Morocco. The sea air and the freedom of living alone made the Empress feel better instantly. And that spring, she was able to return back to the palace in Vienna with a clean bill of health. But after only 4 days back at court, she once again began coughing, hardly slept, and woke up to a fever. Her doctor again recommended that she take leave, this time to the island of Corfu, where her health again improved dramatically. But every time she went back to Vienna, to her mother-in-law, to her passionless marriage, to her structured duties as empress and her children, she got sick again. Beyond that, Vienna was beginning to feel like a hostile place to be. She had always been the subject of vicious court gossip, which made fun of her admittedly quirky personality, and she never acted how they thought an empress should. Sisi was this strong-willed empress who loved to swim naked in the sea, pop in on unsuspecting countrywomen for a bottle of milk, and later got an anchor tattoo on her shoulder in Greece to represent her love of the sea. Outside of the castle, Sisi was becoming incredibly famous throughout Europe. Crowds would gather outside the palace, hoping to just catch a glimpse of the woman that some were beginning to call the most beautiful woman alive. Over the next 2 years, she would spend most of her time outside of Vienna. But by late 1862, Elizabeth would return for her son Rudolph's 4th birthday party, and Franz Josef told her that he wanted another. So, Elizabeth began to avoid him. She would take long walks for hours at a time, or say she wasn't feeling well to avoid doing the deed. In reality, Empress Sisi's reason for not wanting another child was simple. She was afraid of losing her beauty. Although she was just as beautiful as ever, Empress Sisi became obsessed about her appearance, developing a toxic relationship with food and exercise. Standing at 5'8", Sisi never weighed more than 110 pounds, and was known throughout Europe for her insanely small waist, measuring at only 16 inches for most of her life. In fact, she actually developed a, quote, horror of fat women, something that she passed down to her youngest daughter, who was terrified when, as a little girl, she first met Queen Victoria. Sisi's diet was pretty strange, too. She was often disgusted by meat, so her diet usually consisted of only milk and eggs, accompanied occasionally with the juice of a half-raw beefsteak that was squeezed into a thin soup. She would spend hours exercising daily, riding horseback or walking, and demanded that a gym be built in any palace she stayed in. Her hair was another vanity. Falling almost to her ankles, she had dark chestnut hair cared for in a 3-hour daily routine. If any hairs fell out in the middle of the process, she demanded that each hair be collected and presented to her for inspection in a small silver bowl. Once a week, her schedule was cleared to accommodate washing it. Sisi would sit for hours as her hair was washed with a mixture of cognac and eggs. Sisi was very particular about portraits of herself. During the mid-1860s, we have these 2 portraits of her, the Winterhalter portrait and the Georg Raab portrait, where she's in her late 20s. She was also photographed right at the time that the innovation of portrait photography was becoming commonplace. We can see she has a bit of an enigmatic face. She looks a little different in each image, but her defining features are, of course, her beautiful dark eyes and unique lips, making it easy to see why Franz Josef fell in love with her at first sight. In 1866, Franz Josef suffered an embarrassing loss to the Prussians, and behind the scenes, his empire was on the verge of collapse. After years of avoiding another pregnancy, Elizabeth suddenly had a change of heart in 1867. But she told Franz Josef that her feelings could easily change depending on how he dealt with the crisis of his empire. That same year, Austria and Hungary agreed to create a united empire, which would end military rule in Hungary and restore its constitution. and in return, Franz Josef and Sisi would be named King and Queen of Hungary. A little less than a year later, her fourth child was born in a palace outside of Budapest. This time, no one would take her child away from her. Elizabeth would name this daughter Marie Valerie, and all of her repressed maternal instincts seemed to finally flourish. She became obsessed with this new baby, with some courtiers even referring to Marie Valerie as Elizabeth's only child, because of how much more attention she paid to her than the others. Now, I personally don't think that this is fair, given that not only did Archduchess Sophie take her other children away at birth, but also horribly shamed her as a mother during the most traumatic period of her life. She still loved her children deeply, but their relationship was complicated. Through it all, Franz Josef is said to have passionately loved Sisi, even through the hard times, even through all her complexity and her strangeness. She was still the woman he fell in love with at first sight. Although most historians don't believe that Sisi returned his feelings, she still at the very least felt a warm friendship with Franz. Sisi's young daughter kept her busy for a few years, but she began to eventually need her less and less. Elizabeth's mind once again began to wander. She was restless. She began to travel outside of Vienna more and more often, until she rarely stayed at court at all. Over the course of years, Sisi traveled all over the Mediterranean. She also traveled to Morocco, Algeria, Malta, Turkey, and Egypt, becoming an iconic figure throughout Europe. Her adventurous spirit stopped her from staying anywhere too long. She said, "If I arrived at a place and knew that I could never leave it again, the whole stay would become hell, despite being paradise." She continued traveling through Greece, falling in love with the island and its people, after reading about Achilles in the Iliad. She's reported to have at least 10 companions that traveled with her, nearly all of which were Greek men in their mid-20s. The only outlier was her therapist, a Swedish man who she also occasionally wrote romantic poetry about. Unfortunately for Sisi, her carefree life of leisure and travel was about to take a tragic turn. On January 29, 1889, Elizabeth was in Vienna for a family dinner party. She was leaving for Hungary soon and wanted to spend some quality time with all of her now adult children. But in the middle of dinner, her son and heir, Rudolf, abruptly excused himself. Apparently, he had an early morning at the Imperial Hunting Lodge ahead of him. But a shocking twist of fate was about to hit the family. That next morning, Rudolf would be found dead alongside his mistress, Mary Vetsera, in an apparent murder-suicide pact. The reasons why they did this are sort of clouded, but it's thought that Rudolf had felt guilty about giving his wife syphilis, and then Mary Vetsera refused to live without him. Elizabeth was shattered by her son's death, plunging her into a sadness like never before. During the coming years, her older sister Helena would pass away, followed by her mother, then her younger sister in a tragic fire. Sisi would wear black for the rest of her life. Eventually, she would resume her travels in Europe, which seemed to be the only thing that distracted her from her melancholy. In 1898, Elizabeth traveled to Geneva, Switzerland under an alias, but someone at her hotel had recognized her and leaked the news to the press. On September 10th, Elizabeth began one of her famous long walks. At 1:35 p.m., 25-year-old Luigi Liceni approached Sisi and attempted to peer under her white umbrella. He then stumbled into the Empress, stabbing her in the chest with a sharpened needle file. The meeting was so swift that her entourage assumed the man had simply bumped into her, and they continued to walk. But soon, Sisi had collapsed. "What has happened?" she asked. When a passing man helped her up, he asked her if she was in pain. She replied with a simple no, and then lost consciousness. By the time medical help reached her, she was gone. When Franz Josef heard the news of his wife's death, he was distraught, thinking that she had taken her own life. It was only later, when a detailed message of her assassination was sent, that he finally learned what had happened. Her assassin, Luigi, was arrested the next day. He was initially presumed insane for killing Elizabeth, who was known to be a good and charitable woman. In reality, he was an anarchist that had missed his opportunity to assassinate a French pretender to the throne who had left Geneva earlier that same day. Wanting to spill some imperial blood, he went after Sisi after he had learned that she was in town from the newspaper leak. All over Hungary, pictures of Sisi were framed on desks and grand pianos, and there was an outrage in Hungary when her coffin only read Empress of Austria, until they hastily added "and Queen of Hungary." Sisi was an unlikely free spirit, sadly confined to a court life she was never fit for. Today, she's an almost cult-like figure in Austria and Hungary, known for her love of ordinary people, her fight for Hungarian representation, and, just like she always wanted, her legendary beauty has been immortalized, untouched by age and forever young. Since we've already talked about Sisi's appearance, let's get into the recreations. In order to appear eternally youthful, Sisi didn't allow photographs to be taken of herself after the age of 30. And although she lived to 60, her last official portrait was made when she was 42. I brought Sisi to life by compositing images of her over time. I wanted to make her look more like the photographs, of course, which vary slightly from these stylized painted portraits. So let's take a look at my recreations of the beautiful Empress Sisi now.